Okay. Welcome to ARMA International's webinar, What the IG Maturity Index Report 2021 is Telling Us. I'm Ann Snyder, the Content and Education Director at ARMA International, and I'll be one of your presenters for this webinar. For those of you who have attained your IGP, the Information Governance Professional Certification, today's webinar counts toward one continuing education credit in the information management category. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to ask it. Make sure you put it in the Q&A box, not just the chat. We're unlikely to get to all questions, but we'll respond to any remaining questions received after the webinar has concluded. We also have Kayla Rodriguez on the phone. She's in the background and is going to field some questions to us live if it makes sense to do so. Hi, Kayla. Say hi to everyone.
Hello.
Okay, thanks. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items I have to take care of. Up first is membership. If you haven't checked out your membership benefits lately, we are excited to offer online and virtual opportunities to connect and get resourced through your membership. If you aren't an ARMA professional member, as you can see, there are a lot of resources to take advantage of, and it's an affordable way to get resourced as an information professional. Be sure to keep an eye out for our members only webinar series. Our next one is coming up next week with Ann Gortz on April 1st, and I promise that's not a trick. It's just going to be awesome. Its topic is at the intersection of information governance and cybersecurity, risk, and compliance. It's going to be an awesome webinar, so make sure you're there. More information about ARMA membership and getting started can be found at our website at arma.org. Conference. Be part of the action, learning from and networking with the finest in the profession at our first hybrid conference. It's going to be live in Houston with virtual components online. October 17th through the 20th, 2021, with more than 100 sessions and 8 session tracks on the agenda. There's something for everyone to learn at ARMA InfoCon 2021. And I'm going to play this because I have this awesome video from last year. I want to get everyone excited about coming to Houston. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, that ends the commercial portion of our discussion today. I hope everybody is psyched about coming to Houston. If you can make it, if you're able to travel, or if not, joining us online. Pre-registration for InfoCon 2021 opens on Monday, so keep an eye in your inbox, and I hope to see you there. All right, let's turn now to the IG Maturity Index Report 2021. Today, we're going to look at the objectives of the Maturity Index, why we started this back in 2019, what the design methodology is that we use, its relationship to the IGIM, the maturity scale that we use, and a little bit on our survey delivery and analysis. Then we'll dig into some of the data and analysis, looking at respondent demographics, maturity levels, and then a comparison across IG maturity levels. I'm joined today by Pierre Chamberlain, who is the person who was well behind this back in 2019. So Pierre, can you just say a few words and talk to us a little bit about what your thinking was behind this when you first approached us with this idea?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you. Lots changed since then. NetGovern was the initial sponsor. Now you're seeing my background being iPro. iPro acquired NetGovern in July of last year and has taken on the sponsorship and thought leadership role behind continuing to fund this very important initiative. And so we're very happy to be here this year and expecting to continue for many more years to come. The initial impetus was really based on a realization after speaking with a lot of our clients and a lot of peers in the industry, vendors, policymakers, and practitioners, that there was no real hard evidence, common baseline that people could point to in order to encourage their organizations to make what we thought were the required investments to get better at what they're doing. And that fundamentally our biggest competitor was status quo, resistance to change. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to get the evidence required to move conversations away from opinionation and really get them towards investable action plans that enabled the practitioners to say, here's how we're going to make a difference, and here's why we need to make these investments, and we need the resources, financial, organizational, other, to continue to develop these programs, and especially to be given the freedom to invest in the long term. Because what we saw is that there's none of these things that are really short term. There was, however, a clear list of short-term wins, little things that can make a big difference. And I think we're going to speak about a lot of those today again. And we wanted to surface those in the hope that it could get people who were reticent to get started. Like, here's some easy wins that you can have in your organization, and it'll get you on the right path. And so it was really that idea of creating the lingua franca, the common dialogue, and those data points that we can all agree to. Yeah, we're making a lot of progress here, or wow, we need to. And then, of course, the comparison basis, so that in my organization, I can look and say, yeah, we're doing pretty well, or wow, we really need to get more serious about our initiatives, because as compared to the industry, we're deficient.
We're behind, right?
And we use that word often throughout the results that we'll see today. Deficiencies are only alarming if you decide to not do anything about them. So hopefully this also resonates as a survey that pushes towards hope and is aspirational, that people see this and go, okay, we can get better, and here's how we're going to do it. So yeah, those were the initial motivations. The first year was an astounding success. Last year, for all of the reasons that we know, was a little bit more challenging, but I'll let you cover that off as we speak to the survey results and methodology.
And I do think 2020, the results are interesting, and we have to figure out whether this is just a blip. But I think 2020, I think, told us a lot about ourselves too. So to build on what Pierre said, the objectives are: this was meant to be a data-driven, point-in-time measure of IG maturity for organizations' IG programs. It was meant to be a reference point for a year-over-year comparison, and this year is the 2021 report presents our 2020 data, so data taken at the end of last year, and it's meant to be continued year over year, so we can ideally look for some trend lines, some progress, hopefully upward. Maybe not this year, but hopefully upward over time. And again, I do want to reiterate what Pierre said. This is meant to be aspirational. This is meant to be a point in time and help you build as a guideline for forward movement, forward trajectory in your IG program. It was meant to be an industry benchmark against which organizations can compare the state of their IG programs. And in the future, when we get a much larger sample size, we're hoping to actually slice and dice this data along industries, specific industries and verticals, so you can compare yourself against organizations within your industry. We don't have sufficient data right now to make that make a whole lot of sense. We would be really just splitting hairs at this point. And it's meant to be an aid to effective IG program implementation and improvement. So we'll talk about this in a second when we're talking about what the IGM is and how it was tied to that. And the reason we did that was so that you would have a roadmap, not only a point in time assessment of where you are, but a map to how you could get to where you want to go. So using this survey to help you identify deficiencies, and what Pierre said is they're not such a bad thing as long as you can map a path toward progress and do something about them. And that's what we're trying to do by tying these two things together, the point in time assessment for your organization. And you can take this at any time. This is the industry benchmark point in time, but you can take it on your own. And in the survey report, we provide enough information to allow you to do that. You can map out, identify the deficiencies that you have in your program, and then take it to the next step and look at resources that will allow you to fill those gaps. Do you have anything to add there, Pierre?
No, I think you covered all of the high points that make this report, so important. And I guess the one thing that I will add is I encourage everybody to take this report and to really surface it. And I think that that's where we've gotten the most feedback from our clients, was when they actually made this something that had the awareness at board level. And otherwise it's close to heart, you get it, but once the stakeholders, who are the ones that ultimately are entrusted with that fiduciary duty of reducing risk, reducing operational costs, and creating value from the information assets of the organization, when they see that and they're able to have those business-driven conversations. And so even if you're not doing as great as you thought you should, and if you're doing way better, well, geez, give yourself the pat on the back. Take this and circulate it. Make it something that gets that awareness at the board level or at the executive level, depending on your organization. So it sparks the right kind of conversations.
And to that end, we will make the slides available, as we always do at the end of any of these webinars, but we also put together a graphics packet that you can use for inclusion in your internal presentations, and those are Creative Commons licensed so that you can use them in that way. So we put this data together for you, and we've hopefully put it in a format that's useful for you. If you have any thoughts or suggestions on that, if something would be better for you, please let us know. But it will be put together in a slide deck with graphics that you can download and use. So in terms of the design and methodology, so we set out those objectives, but to achieve those objectives, we tried to design a survey that was relatively simple and repeatable, simple, repeatable assessment of IG maturity. And I think a lot of surveys can be, have great content in them, but they can just try to do too much. So people burn out on the survey. We wanted to get at least something high level and consistent year over year. And we're hoping to drill down into each of the maturity levels in future points. But for the first years, wanted to make sure we got the high level data points. So aside from some basic demographic questions, the survey is actually only 8 questions assessing IG maturity. So just its relationship to the IG, the information governance implementation model. So I think some of you are probably familiar with this. I've talked about it several times at Legal Tech and elsewhere. The IGIM, the information governance implementation model, is a functional approach to information governance, and it explores several elements that are needed to develop in these 7 key areas that are necessary for implementing a successful IG program. And I think that's the emphasis. It's about implementation, not just description, although we're using it here in that way. during this survey. So the 7 key areas, you can read them there. The IG Maturity Index is aligned with the IGIM and assesses IG program maturity overall. So we have an overall IG program maturity and across each of these 7 areas of the model. The reason for, again, for aligning with the IG Maturity Index, or aligning the IG Maturity Index to the IGIM, is that it allows IG professionals to identify gaps in their IG programs and then to build a unified implementation approach that are tied to each of these 7 areas. And ARMA's target is to build out resources and to, tag resources that are tied to each of the areas of the model. So you identify a gap and then you can go out and find resources that are useful specifically for addressing the issues that your company or organization is facing. And we're already in progress right now in updating the IGP exam and aligning it with this model too.
But I think it's important to underscore that the progress in each of the areas really helps accelerate. It's a very dynamic relationship with it. And so the investments that you make, the challenges that you tackle have this matrix effect. And so the graphic presentation, there's we call it the hive. There's a little bit of a symbolism there in that they're all intricately interconnected and they have an impact on each other. And so we'll talk a little bit later in some of the survey results where we think that those acceleration vectors happen, but it's really important that through your organization, it's a team effort and you're getting people on board. If your IT team starts to develop certain competencies, certain things that accelerate your maturity, there's going to be a direct impact across the other areas of the implementation model that raise your maturity. And so it's not a solo sport, it's a team sport where each person's contribution helps to elevate that maturity level. And so just.
And this is, again, I think this is true with every single model. There are limitations to the model. This is just a different way of organizing it. Certainly there is overlap and interconnectivity. I absolutely agree with that. And this is just a deeper dive into the elements within each of these. I'm not going to linger on these too much right here, but we'll go into each section as we look at the maturity for each of the 7 areas. But again, these graphics are available and on our website. I'll give links to that at the end of the webinar, but these are available for use and download by you. So the maturity scale that we use, and just I want to take a moment on this. Respondents were asked to assess their program's IG maturity overall and with respect to these 7 areas using a 5-point maturity scale, of course, with an opt-out. We wanted to make sure people completed and participated, and also we didn't want to force people into an answer if they couldn't answer it. This might look familiar to some of you. It was adapted from ARMA's generally accepted record-keeping principles, the principles maturity model, and this was to enable cross-comparison for organizations who are already using the principles maturity model. The first general levels are described in this chart above, but for each of the 7 areas of the IGIM, we tailored the maturity levels at each of the levels in the 5-point scale to that area. So we have a description of what an organization at level 3 might be with respect to their structure. So this is the generic one. All of that information, again, is in the report, will be available to you. So if you wanted to replicate this maturity test at your organization, wanted to rank your own organization to see how it compares, you have everything that you need to do that with the report in hand. So what we see is the first 2 here are deficient ones, though. So we considered anything that's below a 3 is deficient. So this is basically non-existent and really severely substandard. Some development is happening at level 2. Essential is, you're just getting by. You're doing enough, but you're in a reactive state. So if we're thinking about making dinner, you don't have dinner plans for the week. You're sometimes ordering takeout, but everyone is basically, nobody's malnourished or undernourished. We're getting by, but it's not perfect. Whereas these areas, proactive, you're starting to handle things, anticipate issues before they happen, and then transformational. I mean, this is where we're in flow at this point. You're optimizing your organization.
Maybe to add just a little bit of color on that, I think the pre-conference started, we had a discussion about how this relates to other scales that have become well entrenched in the business vocabulary. And Ann and I were exchanging on whether or not net promoter score, where it's very clear that when you're asked a question, would you recommend doing business with us to one of your peers? What the Net Promoter Score organization found was that only 9s and 10s mattered. Conversely to popular belief that a 7 and an 8 made you a promoter, they didn't. That 6, 7, 8 made you neutral, or sorry, 7, 8 made you neutral. 6 and below made you actually a detractor. The only thing that mattered was 9s and 10s. And so if we apply that to here, we should be questioning our thinking and saying, is proactive good enough in this day and age where this constant barrage of more regulations, more retention schedules, more data types, more privacy, more ways to create information and to share information, is anything less than proactive acceptable? Is essential? We didn't call essential deficient, but that's something that we'll continue to study next year, and maybe our ambition level should shift, and it should become that the conversation, just like, unless we're getting 9s and 10s, we're not creating promoters, we're not growing the business. Unless we're targeting proactive to transformational, we're not doing enough.
And I think with any of these, if there's the sort of tendency to pick the middle if you're not sure, so that that essential could be substantially less enthusiastic of or less accurate of an assessment, just a meh, I don't know kind of. We're not bad, but we're not great. So the survey, our first survey, we've already said debuted in 2019 at InfoCon 2019, and we're in our second year. This was at the InfoCon 2020, so this was a virtual delivery, and we held it open from conference through the end of the year, and we're going to keep doing that year over year, so we have a point in time comparison. So our target audience is, of course, IG professionals. We had 420 responses after processing, so that's down substantially from last year, and we toyed with the idea of keeping it open a little bit longer to get more people, and then the concern is now we're not getting that defined point in time. So in the interest of keeping it as a real point in time survey and keeping it consistent year over year, so we can have a clearer and more useful comparison, we closed it in the same fashion as we did the previous year. All right, so into the results and analysis. The split by organization size was very similar to what it was in the first year. We had roughly 50-50 people who were in what we were calling large organizations, and ones that were in this less than 1,000 employees. So again, roughly the same split as last year. And then we had a little bit of deviation on this year, but it's not surprising. Our core audience, the roles represented in this survey, are records management professionals, IG professionals, and information management. We saw a little bit of an uptick in privacy and a downtick. We had an unusual survey group last year in the 2019 that bumped our information technology up previously, so this has gone down a little bit. So the first of the 7 areas of the IGIM that we're looking at is the steering committee. And the steering committee, don't get hung up on that word, not everybody calls it that, but the steering committee is meant to represent the people aspect of your organization's IG program. This is the organization's IG leadership team, and it should include broad representation from each of the interests that we have represented here, enumerated here. It's not limited to those. And again, think of these as the roles. There might be a single person handling multiple roles depending on the size of your organization. So it's the function that is represented in your IG or your information governance strategy team, basically. So if you were evaluating your organization's IG program based on this area, you consider things like, does your organization have a formal or an informal group? An informal group might just do fine with your organization, depends. Does it have sufficient authority or influence to make IG decisions? Does the group meet on a regular basis? Is it handling things proactively or reactively? And are all of the relevant information stakeholders, I've already mentioned this, in place to actually make IG decisions in an effective way? So we worked these and other considerations of the descriptions again at each of those maturity levels. So it's specific to steering committees, specific to the people aspects of your organization. And here's what we found. Now, I'm going to look here first at the data from 2020 because the reveal of, I'm sorry, from the 2020 report, which is the data from 2019. At the tail end of 2019, just to get us oriented for a second. Just there's a ton of information on each of these graphics, and this, I have to say, this is, I was telling Kayla before I got on here, this is the hardest webinar from one perspective. It's that it's very, very data heavy. This is, you need a little bit of time to digest this data. So we'll be throwing a lot of numbers at you. Take time when the report comes out to sit down and read through it and really see how much data is actually presented here. And like each of these graphics is just chock full of information. So what we see here on the x-axis first is that scale from level 1 to level 5. The gray bars represent total respondents. So this is 9.2% of total respondents rank themselves as level 1. The blue bars represent the small to mid-sized organizations, and the green bars represent large organizations. So we've also included these trend lines so you can just get a general feel of how this data is laid out. What we can see from this, if you just absorb that part of it, is that, on average, the larger organizations sort of trend a little bit more mature than the small ones, but they're not outstripping them. And we can see that the distribution on here is roughly a third, and a third. So a third of organizations saying that they're at level 1 or level 2, which we're calling deficient, a third that are sort of falling in this middle area, and a third that are doing something a little bit better, and that they're a proactive or transformational. Now, we also, in some of the other analysis, grouped these three. We said if you're doing essential or above, if you're getting by or doing something better, we consider that as succeeding, and anything less than that as deficient. Do you have any thoughts on this yet, Pierre, before I do the reveal?
I would do the reveal and then I'll give the thoughts.
Okay, so again, this is the 2020, so the 2019 data, so tail end of 2019, and this is what we see at the tail end of 2020 on the same measure. All right, so we're seeing obviously a major downward trend, and it's important to note that steering committee was actually one of the least mature that we saw in 2019, and we're seeing an even more downward trend. So previously we had close to a third of organizations saying that they were at essential or above, and now we're close to the 50-50 mark. So about 51% of organizations say they're doing essential or more, and we have almost 50% of the survey respondents saying that their organizations are deficient. So that's a substantial downward trend, and it's just close to the 50-50 mark. So Pierre, thoughts?
Cause for concern and cause for continued I mean, this directly speaks to the fact that we need to keep doing this year over year. Cause for concern, the transformational level is the one that was affected the most. If you go back to the previous slide, there's a 50% drop almost in transformational. Mm-hmm. That likely means that the leaders, the people that working in organizations that had achieved the ability to get the resources and the budgets are the ones that rated themselves significantly lower and said, mm-hmm. Now, is this a blip point in time, COVID related? We're going into survival mode, and so mm-hmm. we're stripping away resources from things. Let's remember that we did this at maybe not the height, but almost the height of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And a lot of business thinking was being colored by, we're going into lockdown mode, and we mm-hmm. don't know when we're going to come out of this. And so it could very well be that there were short-term decisions to shift budget allocations away.
Mhm.
And that in itself is also not a good sign, which it means that you know, people were easy to switch over and say, well, you know, we're going to take away from here and put here. What's the real business value? So there continues to be work to be done there on making sure that these are not, that are hard achieved programs and budgets are not so easy to sacrifice when comes time to making more difficult choices, right?
Mhm.
So clearly a cause for concern, and hopefully next year what we're going to see is an adjustment and people getting back on track with the steering committees. And I consider the steering committees to be maybe not the most impactful, but certainly number one, number two, because that's where the strategy is determined. And alignment gets created. What we've seen in the blocks that we had of the steering committee, we've seen a roll up of the three: legal, risk, and privacy have tended now to get rolled up to the chief legal officer in larger organizations, or a combination of inside counsel plus external counsel in smaller organizations. But those three are now together, right? And so the steering committee role and the maturity layered in with the business units and IT or information management, really drive that strategic thinking. And so I'll just remind people briefly, the speaker that we had at InfoCon was Dan Heath,
Mhm.
and he spoke to his recent book, which is now almost a year old, called Upstream. And it was all about helping your organization to move from a reactive stance, i.e. downstream thinking, where you react, to where instead of becoming great problem solvers, great people at deploying technology, or that we start thinking upstream. And
Mhm.
really, IG as a profession is an upstream thinking.
Mhm.
We're there to make sure if we do our job well, there's a whole lot of downstream things that never happen. Unfortunately, we don't get congratulated, or we don't get awards or medals or anything like that, because the organization never sees the problem
Mhm.
that could have occurred. And so for me, this is a reminder for people to, hey, go, and if you purchase the book, or we're about to send out the e-copies of the book to those that registered for the seminar, or registered for the survey. You know, go and read the book and think about upstream, because really the steering committee is the one that provides that strategic upstream thinking that makes all of the other things come into play.
I do want to echo Pierre's sentiments that I think that this is actually one of the most important of the 7 areas, and yet that was one of the reasons why it was so concerning last year, and is even more concerning that we saw that this was one of the lowest in terms of IG maturity. It seems to be the one that just obviously most critical, having the right people at the table to make the decisions. I just want to answer a question that came in. Someone asked, why isn't finance on here? This is not meant to be exhaustive. It's a model. It's not perfect, but certainly I do think finance should be on here too. That doesn't necessarily naturally fall in with business units, but I think finance, it certainly should be something, someone at the table as well. So it's not it's not exhaustive. It's high level that at least these people, and within your organization, you have to find the right people to be there. If there's a unit that we're not thinking of, obviously you want to include them.
Certainly not meant to be exclusionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was another question. And this was a point that I was thinking too, is what is this blip that is 2020? Is it that people, there's a potential that people were overestimating the state of their organization in 2019, and then 2020 happened and they're having a more realistic perspective on things. I think that 2020 forced us to take note of things that we hadn't before. So we've been preaching to everyone that you have to be out there and doing a digital transformation, and all of that starts to sound like buzz and fluff in the background. It gets lost. And then with everyone moving to working virtually, the reality of that hit. And I think people were starting to see that some of their processes that they thought were fine and worked just fine when they were in the office really didn't work very well at all in the remote environment. So let me just move on from this. So again, we're seeing this downward trend. I did also want to comment that what I see when I look at this is, and we'll see this in comparison to some of the other areas of the IGIM that we look at, it's the movement is from these higher levels down to deficient. So that's interesting to me. It's not just getting stuck here, that you overestimated yourself and you course corrected to essential on this one. You know, people are in 2020 are looking at organizations that they thought were doing really well or essential or more, and are now calling them deficient. So we see the trend line is below what we considered the cutoff for at least just getting by. And we'll see how this compares to the very next one that we look at. Okay. So authorities is the next area of the IGM, and think of authorities as the guide rails for the organization's information governance efforts. Roughly, these are the rules that help you guide IG decisions, and these are things like authoritative frameworks, standards, regulations, as well as internal things too, like the company's risk tolerance, the organizational culture. People often forget about those things as important guide rails to decision making. So understanding these relevant authorities helps you ensure that you're meeting your organization's obligation as well as the objectives of your IG program. So if you were evaluating your program with respect to this area, you'd look at things like, is your organization, are your organization's legal, regulatory, and compliance and business needs clearly understood, documented, and followed? Have appropriate standards and practices been identified? Are they understood? Are they being incorporated? What's your company's culture and its risk tolerance? And do you understand it well enough to consider that in your decision making? So again, we asked respondents in this case to rank their organization's maturity level, to select the maturity level that best described their organization on average with respect to these on that 5-point scale. This is what we saw in, sorry, I jumped there. This is what we saw in 2019. And again, we see sort of a nice smooth curve there. And we had a clear majority. This one was actually one of the more mature areas of information governance. So we had like 72%, so more than 2/3 in this case, were at essentials or above. So, again, a clear majority of organizations thought they were doing pretty well on this parameter. We go into 2020, we see a downward trend that shifts it considerably. So it shifts, we see a shift from these higher levels, proactive and transformational, but a lot of them are taken up in essential. So we see a peak here that's a little bit different than what we saw in the steering committee example, but less so of a move down into deficient. So, for authorities, we're still in the 70s, the 70% range that say that their organization is at essentials or above. Any thoughts on this, Pierre? This is a little bit different.
Yeah, it's better work to be done, continued work to be done to move to proactive and transformational. I think the one thing that we perhaps have come to realize, and it echoes one of the questions, as we do more, we realize how much more we have to go. And I think one of the things that the difference between the 2 years is people recognizing that authorities are not static. They're not. Mm-hmm. They're not a policy that gets put in place and doesn't get revisited. Becomes ineffective. They need pruning and caring and evolution, and they need to be revisited and circulated. And you need to make sure that people really grasp the importance, especially with regards to elements like cybersecurity, retention, the things that have a direct and quantifiable effect on the business. And so, the authorities part becoming more dynamic, I think, is driving some of that, where people are going, yep, we need to not assume that because we came out with a retention policy or a privacy policy 3 years ago that it's fresh and it's meaningful. Mm-hmm. These are really dynamic, and there's a calendar, there's a best before date on all of our policies, mm-hmm. and we need to be revisiting them. And somebody mm-hmm. has to have that ownership of the authorities to make sure that they stay relevant, because our businesses, our organizations are constantly evolving. We're merging and demerging and starting up new business activities that have different obligations, different requirements. And so the authorities have to equally evolve alongside them.
Again, I think this one is that I agree with everything you said there. I'm interested in sort of what's happening in people's, change in understanding. So it's like here we see people basically just sort of course correcting downward, saying, yeah, maybe we overestimated potentially how we assessed our organization previously, but the one that we looked at first, the steering committee, it's very interesting to me how many of them are now saying it's not just that we're getting by, we're doing worse than getting by. So that, again, the comparison between these two is interesting to me. So I didn't dwell on this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Peggy mentions in the questions, one of the things that speaks directly to what you've just spoken is organizations that, because of the pandemic, have switched massively to Teams or Zoom or Slack, and they're now saying, well, that's what we're calling our system of record. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, in most cases, without any formal disclaimer to the organization that is it, right? There's been disclaimers to the organization that we are retaining email. We may go back and we may all of the formal legal things. Teams just happened, and then there's the two parts of Teams. There's the part of Teams which is just the content, right? And what are you doing with it? But then there's the whole metadata part of Teams, which is Teams knows where you are and when you were online and when you were logged in and so there's the file portion, there's the meeting portion, but then there's the whole chat portion. And many organizations never got to the point of saying, we consider everything you say in chat, no matter when you say it, to actually be and
a record.
We need to be aware of the consequences of that.
And it's one of those things it amazes me that we're kind of repeating the same issues that we did with email. So email, came out and we were using it and hadn't thought of all of the consequences of that being a record or things being stored in there. We're doing exactly the same thing again with other, chat and instant messaging functions. When again, what's interesting to me too is that they're much harder to connect than across platforms. So
in our organization, we've seen an interesting evolution of email conversations move to a Teams chat and then move back to an email conversation. And it's the same. It used to be hard enough to follow a thread in an email conversation. Now that thread is jumping from mail to chat back to, and even the way people answer emails now, people are answering email messages with things that they would normally just answer in a chat. And very short abbreviated things that are more akin to a chat interaction than an email, but they're just taking the habits developed over here and applying them over here. It's become one medium almost, but our organizations are treating them from a regulatory retention legal point of view quite differently. And so there's going to be some catching up to be done there.
And it's always good. So one of the things we'd like to look for is, hey, let's take this offline. And historically it was like, give me a call. And now it's like, send me an IM or a chat, snap, like send me a chat or something like that. And it's just very interesting that those are things we look for. And now it's trying to track those things down. And so it's a mess.
I'll just speak of one thing that we've had come up on Discovery recently. With email, there's a very simple metadata flag, which was the message opened, and that's undeniable. You either opened it or you didn't. It's binary, right? In a chat,
can't tell.
Were you looking at the screen or not looking at the screen? Like, we're not there yet, right? And so if I'm in a chat with other people, I may have not been part of, and then I answer some things a little bit later. Well, there's an assumption you were in the chat, therefore that information.
Therefore you knew, but you may not have, right?
But you may not have paid attention to it because that chat is open all day long. and people filter in and filter out, right? So it's very, very different from a discovery perspective as
Mhm.
well.
And I do think also it's the point about the devolution of the quality of the chat, of the communication. So the things that were once in, we finally got people to use some formality in email, and we're seeing I think a backslide in that. So huzzah. It's more work for the lawyers. Anyway, so we are a little bit behind. So I'm just gonna, some of this data again, it's I think this conversation is more fruitful than just going into the data on its own. I think the data is exciting and interesting, but it's something that you should digest over time. So I think the report is, get the report, grab a cup of coffee and sit down and read it. We'll have that available in April. And it'll be downloadable and free, of course, and that is the place where you can go in and really consider the implications for your organization and what these trends might mean for the industry. So just quickly, I'm going to zip through a couple and just go through some highlights because we're already at just 10 minutes shy of the hour. So supports are basically the elements of your organization that are available to establish your IG program, the things that sort of support it. These include change management, project management. They're not necessarily, IG disciplines, but they help with your information governance program. These are all, so some things that you might want to consider if you're assessing your organization with respect to supports. You want to know, do you have these functions in place? Very often, again, think of them as functions. You might be playing that function yourself. You might be running your own communication strategy with respect to a policy that you're rolling out. For existing supports, are they used? Are they helpful? Do they apply a consistent and repeatable methodology? A lot of times they don't, and that's a type of deficiency as well. And then the question is, are these things available on a regular basis? Are they created and added to projects, for example, ad hoc? What we saw last year, in 2019, again, was this sort of third, and actually supports were slightly lower on average than the other areas of the IGIM. And like other areas this year, we saw a slight downward trend. It's not as exaggerated as the others, but again, you see it's a move predominantly into the essential area. Pierre, unless you have anything on this. By the way, I also have a second chart here that's doing the year over year. So this is the 2019 data versus the 2020, and all of that will be available for you. Otherwise, I'll move on to processes. Okay, so processes are to ensure consistency in your organization's IG program. These include metrics, policies, procedures, and rules, benchmarking, like this kind of report, as well as accountability structures. And they help you to implement an IG program through informed and consistent decision making. So instead of, with this report again, instead of guessing about what, having a nebulous, fuzzy idea of where your IG program is, having a metric to say, look, this is a ranking this year. These are the deficiencies we've identified. So it's something that's concretized. So when you're evaluating your IG program with respect to this area, you'd look at things like our policies and procedures, rules clearly defined. Are people regularly trained on them? So this is taking sort of that next step. You had the authorities, and now you have your internal processes based on executing against those authorities, for example. Are there accountability structures in place to ensure compliance? And are you using things like benchmarking and metrics to assess your program in a meaningful and consistent way? So what did we see? So this was last year, 2019. And again, this one was slightly lower on average than the other areas of the IGIM. And of course, we saw a downward trend. What's disturbing here is, again, we have a downward trend into this deficient. So it's not just a course correction of over-assessed, proactive, and transformational down to essential. We see a bump in organizations saying that they're in the deficient zone. Any thoughts on this one, Pierre?
The same concern, especially the transformational level that gets impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is that reset because of the pandemic and because resources were stripped away? or is it something more significant? And so we're going to have to pay attention in this year's survey and dig deeper between those two, the proactive and the transformational, and see if we start that trend back, or if it continues to be a challenge for people. Are we faced with something where everybody gets their organization to be a B+ student and there's no grit anymore? We just say, well, we're good enough. And until something more profound starts to affect us, or we'll be there. And hopefully that's not the case, because as a profession, we don't want to be the guys where it's like, yeah, we get it right most of the time. No, we want to be the ones where we're saying we're getting it right all the time. And back to my upstream thinking, that we've helped our organizations to shift their thinking to a far more prescriptive and proactive model.
All right, I'm going to zip through a couple of these last ones quickly so we can just take some time for a little bit of Q&A. I see some questions building up there. So capabilities, these are what's in place to guide the information through your organization throughout that life cycle. So I think of this one as we have the information life cycle right on the graphic there. This is the one that is squarely within the realm of records and information management. All of us are familiar with this type of a graphic. So things you want to consider here is, does your organization correct information, get the correct information in the right hands at the right time, and make sure conversely that certain information is kept out of the wrong hands. Are there internal and external threats to information addressed? So we're, protection and privacy. Can you find what you need, and so on. So what did we see here? Last year, this actually was fairly mature, which was sort of heartening. In 2019, it was fairly mature. And again, that seems to make sense, given that it is sort of squarely within the purview of the people who would be attending the conference. And it's a good thing to see that this was doing pretty well. We saw, again, a downward trend, though, this year. A lot of the organizations, though, moved to this essential level. So there's a downward correction, but a substantial increase in the deficient categories as well. So we went from close to 72% of organizations saying that they were meeting the essentials or above to something like 2/3. So it's closer to 66%. And then we'll move quickly to structures. So structures are the building blocks to your information organization. These include storage structures like information architecture, taxonomy, and metadata, as well as system structures, technology architecture, along with file formats and transmission formats and protocols and things like that. So when you're assessing your organization on this, you'd want to consider things like, does your organization have an information taxonomy? Is it consistent across systems? Does your information architecture show how your organization's information systems are related, and so on? So what did we see here? Last year, this was again, I keep saying last year, 2019, this was one of the more deficient areas of the IGIM. And again, we see a downward trend. Here we see, again, whereas we had about 2/3 of organizations saying that they were essential and above, we're now seeing almost 58% of them saying that, 58% of them are now saying that they're essential or above, with 40% saying that they're actually deficient. Any comments on that one, Pierre, before I zip to the last one?
Yeah, for me, after steering, that's the one that mattered most. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where that decision to invest and someone who's answering the survey has that empirical evidence. They're able to say, we spent money on this or we didn't. We're doing more, we're doing the same or less. And so to see it roll back, is after the steering committee, the one that annoys me the most, because I know that it's real world data supported, with where it's very binary. People are able to call that shot. It's a far less nebulous policies. We can have a debate as to whether or not people get it, understand it. Here we're either spending money on IT, on technology architecture, or we're not. And so the fact that it's rolling back for me is we've delayed or we're spending less. And so I'm hoping once again that it's directly related to economic uncertainty, and that we'll push back. The underlying part of that is, why was it so easy? Why did it not? Because there was other budgets that were unaffected, right?
Mhm.
So as we know, research projects that are good end up by saying, well, we need to do more research.
Mhm.
I think we're here.
Right, and I just to make sure we're not conflating them. So the structures here, we're talking about the how these things are connected, which is related, I think, to this next one, which might give you. Sorry, Pierre didn't get a walkthrough of all this data before, so my apologies. I don't want to sideswipe him, but infrastructure here is, I think this may give you some comfort, Pierre. So infrastructure is, we're thinking here of the actual application. So the one is the structures, is the connectivity of them, and the information structures, how is it organized?
And I got that. I
Yeah,
agree.
okay, all right.
My point was that structures drives infrastructure.
Okay,
And
fair
so
enough.
if you don't have that alignment at an organization level, you're not spending the money, then you're not, or spending the time, you're not going to invest. And so I'm almost dreading the 2022, where we're going to see that as a result of not spending money on structures, we then also decided to not spend more money or continue the growth on the infrastructure investments. So
Okay, fair enough. Sorry,
all good.
sorry. Sorry about that. So infrastructure here it represents the technological capabilities that underpin your organization's information systems. So basically, this is the the ability of your organization's information systems to do what you need them to do. So again, we've talked about it. Structures is more about the mapping of what you have and how it's related and rationalized. So there's an interconnectivity. Pierre mentioned this at the beginning, that these are not things that happen in isolation. So spend on one can have an impact on another, or effort on one can have an impact on the others. So when you're evaluating your organization's program with respect to this area, you'd want to consider things like, do we have the right applications and software in place? Are the tools within your organization's technology environment integrated? Are your organization's networks and connectivity adequate? Now, what's interesting to me, this was actually one of the areas in 2019 that was better on average than the others. We had like 73% of organizations saying that they were at essential or above. And this is the one area where it actually went up in 2020. So there was an improvement. So this is actually somewhat heartening. And certainly part of this is that we were spending more time online. So people, I think maybe had a little bit more awareness of those kinds of issues, but it's good that the trend is, I think, upward as opposed to downward, which is what I would have guessed. I would have, if I beforehand, I would have guessed that this would have been the one where people were most frustrated because of the push so fast, so hard to go virtual, with less planning in place than we normally would have had to do it right. But I'm wondering if maybe necessity made it get done. Necessity made it get done, and I think people have been wanting to be able to work from home, work from anywhere, and they finally see that flexibility. So I'm wondering if there's a little bit of that sentiment captured in this.
I think there is. I think in 7 days we got done what most organizations would have taken 7 years to get accomplished, right? So this massive movement, this digital transformation, and we're on that impetus. We're rolling with that, and we'll continue probably, hopefully for another 18 to 24 months on making those right investments to enable the digital transformation. So we've had this incredible lift and shift of data, and a lot of what I see here is a sentiment that's echoed to the fact that we spent money to get ourselves in a better place. What I don't think happened as profoundly as we would have liked it was a lift and shift. Like, so we moved everything. We still need to go through and determine, are we keeping the right things? How much rot is in there? What are the permission controls? What's the data access governance? How are we reporting it? We moved it from on-prem filers to OneDrive or ShareFile, but we still need to go back and make sure that we're delivering the right maturity level on that. So some work to be done there.
All right, I'm not going to get into this one. This is just sort of a composite of all of the other, it's the overall IG program maturity. I just want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. So conclusions and next steps highlights all, a majority are at essential or better for all 8 maturity measures. There's a clear downward trend except on the infrastructure measure. There's substantial downward trends. We've looked a little bit about possible reasons why. And again, large organizations are generally more mature than mid-sized organizations. So conclusions and next steps, we have a lot to work to do. How do you use this information in graphics? Again, this will be available for download. We want you to be able to assess your own organization if you didn't get to participate in the survey in 2020 and participate in next year, so we can get some good data points. But you will be able to take, there's a question in the chat, will the questions be available? Yes, you would be able to take the survey internally based on that report, so you can do the comparison. This is a call to action and a methodology for doing this. So it's again getting metrics, getting data on where you are. So it's not this nebulous assessment of where you are. It's supposed to be data driven and allow you to use this information to actually get the job of IG done. Graphic citation and these IG targeted materials have already talked about those. The graphics will be available. You'll be able to use it within your presentations. We'll convert them into slides for easy use. And we're building out IGIM targeted resources. So if you find a gap, a deficiency, you can target specific areas. You can get these at the IGIM specific resources at this URL. And the report is going to be available at arma.org/IG-report. Pierre, can you stay on for a few minutes if people want to linger and ask some questions? So, so somebody asked the question of, we are currently using the principles maturity assessment. How do the two relate? So one is more, one is focused on the principles. This is focused predominantly on, well, it's built around a different model, so an implementation approach. So that, again, similar, in the scale, we kept the scales consistent so that you could do a cross comparison, but this is focused on a different trajectory. Let's see. Can you share examples of, hang on one second, I just shifted on the chat window is moving.
There's a question on if all the survey questions are available in the final report. The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
I would encourage you, a fun exercise is to take the functional groups in your steering committee, and if you don't have a formal steering committee, in your informal one, and have your people answer and see how aligned people are inside your organization with regards to their assessment of how well you're doing. If everybody scores about the same, then it's good. Mm-hmm. If you get wildly different scores, we've seen organizations where IT think they're doing such a great job, and everybody else is sort of like, well, no, not really. And so, yeah, it points to areas of improvement. Again, this idea of how do you beat status quo? You start by getting everybody aligned. You start by getting everybody agreeing that these are the things that we can work on that are going to make a big difference. And so having everybody answer the survey, everybody in your organization that on the leadership team, and yeah, alignment is a wonderful thing.
All right, I'm going to wrap there, Pierre. So I want to thank Pierre for joining us today, and again for his support of this project from the very beginning and in all the ways, and especially intellectually. Thank you, Pierre. And I want to remind you not to miss Ann Gore's talk next week. Other webinars will be announced very soon, so keep an eye in your email inbox. Before we close, I'd like to remind you to become an ARMA professional member. ARMA has an array of resources available for you, including white papers, training, articles in our magazine, and much more webinars like this. On behalf of ARMA, I would just like to say thank you for attending today's webinar. Keep an eye out. The report and the graphics will be available shortly. And just want to thank you all for joining us today. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.